On December 19, 1944, the most powerful generals in the Allied command gathered in a cold stone barracks in Verdun, France. The mood was grim. 3 days earlier, Germany had launched the largest offensive against American forces in the entire war. Over 200,000 German soldiers had smashed through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies completely by surprise. American units were surrounded. Entire regiments had been overrun. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction where 7 major roads converged, was about to be encircled by German armor. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower opened the meeting by demanding solutions. He looked around the room at his senior commanders and saw worry on their faces. Then he turned to General George Patton and asked when Third Army could counterattack. Patton looked around the room at the assembled brass and answered without hesitation. He could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Then came the shuffling of feet, the skeptical glances, the barely concealed smirks. One British officer laughed out loud. Eisenhower himself dismissed the claim as absurd. Turning an entire army 90 degrees, disengaging divisions already in combat, moving them over 100 miles on icy roads in the dead of winter, and launching a coordinated attack in 2 days was not just difficult. It was impossible. Armies did not work that way. Logistics did not work that way. The laws of military reality did not work that way. But Patton was not boasting. He was not guessing. He was not playing to the audience. He was stating a fact. While every other general in that room had arrived with only vague ideas and no specific plans, Patton had come with 3 fully developed contingency operations already set in motion. His divisions were already moving north. His staff had already calculated the routes, the fuel requirements, the ammunition needs, the communication networks. All Patton needed was a single code word to launch the most audacious military maneuver of the Second World War. The other generals were surprised by the German offensive because they had dismissed the possibility of it happening. Patton had 3 plans ready because he never dismissed anything. This is the story of how one general saw what others refused to see, how preparation defeated surprise, and how the most remarkable military movement of the European war was accomplished not through luck or genius, but through the disciplined habit of asking the question that nobody wanted to ask. What if we are wrong? The failure that led to the Battle of the Bulge was not a failure of intelligence collection. It was a failure of imagination. The same warning signs were available to every Allied headquarters, from Supreme Headquarters in Paris to the Corps commands in the field. The difference was that most commanders saw what they expected to see, while one commander forced himself to consider what he feared might happen. In the autumn of 1944, the Allied High Command had convinced itself that Germany was finished. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Since the Normandy invasion in June, the Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses. The German army had lost nearly 500,000 men in France alone. Entire divisions had been destroyed. The survivors had fled eastward in disorder. Paris had been liberated in August. Allied armies were pushing toward the Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The consensus at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, was that Germany lacked the men, the fuel, and the equipment to mount any significant offensive operation. The German army was believed to be a spent force, capable only of delaying actions and local counterattacks. A major offensive was considered impossible. This assessment was not unreasonable given the available evidence. German losses since June had been staggering. German fuel production had been devastated by Allied bombing. German industry was struggling to replace lost equipment. The logical conclusion was that Germany could not attack, but the assessment hardened into certainty, and certainty blinded the analysts to contradictory evidence. British intelligence officer Noel Annan later described what he called victory fever. The mood at headquarters required every report to show the German army as incapable of offensive action. Any evidence suggesting otherwise was explained away, minimized, or simply ignored. To suggest that Germany might attack was to mark oneself as an alarmist, out of step with the prevailing wisdom. The over-reliance on Ultra made the problem worse. Ultra was the Allied program that decoded German military communications encrypted by the Enigma machine. It had provided invaluable intelligence throughout the war, allowing Allied commanders to read German orders sometimes before the German recipients received them. Ultra had become the foundation of Allied intelligence assessment. Commanders trusted it completely. But in the weeks before the Ardennes offensive, the Germans maintained strict radio silence. Adolf Hitler had ordered absolute secrecy for the operation he called Watch on the Rhine. All orders were transmitted by courier. All movements were conducted at night. The Enigma machines went quiet. The Ultra intercepts dried up. Instead of recognizing this silence as ominous, a warning that something significant was being hidden, Allied intelligence interpreted it as confirmation that nothing significant was happening. If the Germans were planning something, surely they would be communicating about it. The absence of communications meant the absence of activity. This was a logical assumption. It was also catastrophically wrong. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, which included the forces in the Ardennes, later admitted the fundamental problem in his memoirs. The intelligence community had come to rely far too heavily on Ultra to the exclusion of other sources. When Ultra went quiet, they assumed the enemy had gone quiet too. They forgot that silence could be a weapon. They forgot that the most dangerous enemy is the one who tells you nothing. The Ardennes sector itself was considered a quiet area, suitable for resting exhausted divisions and breaking in green replacements. The region was rugged, covered with dense forests and cut by steep ravines. The roads were narrow and winding. Military doctrine held that such terrain was unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. Tanks needed room to maneuver. The Ardennes did not offer room. This reasoning overlooked an inconvenient historical fact. In May 1940, German panzers had come crashing through these same forests and smashed the Allied line, leading to the fall of France in 6 weeks. The Ardennes had been considered impassable then too. The Germans had passed through anyway. The lesson should have been remembered. It was not. General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps held an 80-mile front in the Ardennes, with only 4 divisions. This was a dangerously thin line by any standard. Each division was responsible for roughly 20 miles of front, several times the normal defensive allocation, but higher headquarters assured Middleton that the Germans opposite him posed no threat. The intelligence estimates were confident. The enemy was defeated. An offensive was impossible. Middleton knew his position was vulnerable. He requested reinforcements. He was told none were available. He was told the quiet sector could afford to be thinly held because the enemy could not attack there. One intelligence officer disagreed with this comfortable consensus, and he served the one commander willing to listen. Colonel Oscar Koch was the G2, the Chief Intelligence Officer for General George Patton's Third Army. He was a meticulous analyst who had served with Patton since the North African campaign in 1942. Unlike many of his counterparts at higher headquarters, Koch did not begin with conclusions and search for supporting evidence. He began with evidence and followed it wherever it led, even when it led to uncomfortable places. Koch had developed a methodology for intelligence analysis that emphasized what he called the enemy's capabilities rather than his intentions. Other analysts tried to determine what the Germans intended to do. Koch focused on what they were capable of doing. The distinction mattered. Intentions could be hidden. Capabilities left traces. By mid-November 1944, Koch had identified troubling patterns in the German order of battle. His team tracked German units through multiple sources, including prisoner interrogations, captured documents, aerial reconnaissance, and signals intelligence. What they found did not match the comfortable assumptions of higher headquarters. Of 15 known German panzer divisions in Western Germany, only 5 were in contact with Allied forces. The location and status of the remaining 10 divisions was unknown. For an intelligence officer, unknown was not reassuring. Unknown meant those divisions could be anywhere, doing anything. Unknown meant a striking force was being assembled somewhere for some purpose, and Allied intelligence had lost track of it. Koch's team tracked German rail movements through aerial reconnaissance. The results were alarming. On November 18, they observed 226 trains moving toward the area north of Third Army's zone. All movement was conducted at night. Daytime reconnaissance showed empty rail yards and quiet stations. Nighttime flights with special equipment revealed intense activity. Someone was going to great effort to hide something very large. The pattern continued through late November and into December. Koch identified 2 major German assembly areas, one between Dusseldorf and Cologne, another around Gerolstein, north of Trier. His analysts detected the presence of fresh infantry divisions, refitted armoured units, and artillery concentrations that had no apparent defensive purpose. The pieces added up to only one conclusion: the Germans were building a striking force. On November 23, Koch's daily intelligence report for Third Army contained an assessment that would prove prophetic. His team had identified what they called a powerful German strategic reserve. The report estimated this force included approximately 500 tanks. The assessment stated plainly that this reserve remained untouched and was being held for future employment. Most intelligence officers at higher headquarters dismissed this assessment as alarmist. Koch did not dismiss his own findings. What troubled Koch most was not simply the existence of the buildup, it was its location. The German concentration was directly opposite the weakest point in the Allied line, the thinly held Ardennes sector of 8th Corps. This was either an extraordinary coincidence or deliberate intent. Koch did not believe in extraordinary coincidences. He also noted that 9 German divisions had been identified opposite 8th Corps, nearly 3 times the number facing the entire rest of Third Army. Why would the Germans concentrate such force opposite a quiet sector? Why would they mass armour in terrain supposedly unsuitable for armour operations? The only answer that made sense was an answer that contradicted everything higher headquarters believed. On December 9, Koch delivered a special briefing to Patton that synthesized weeks of accumulating evidence. He presented a composite analysis of what he believed was a potential enemy counter-offensive. He laid out the indicators one by one: the rail movements, the assembly areas, the missing panzer divisions, the fresh infantry units, the artillery concentrations, the suspicious concentration opposite the weakest Allied sector. Koch told Patton directly that if the Germans attacked in the Ardennes, the enemy was favoured to achieve initial success. The correlation of forces favoured the attacker. The terrain, despite its reputation, could actually help the Germans by channeling the attack and preventing Allied forces from manoeuvring to respond. Most generals would have questioned such an assessment or dismissed it outright. The official intelligence from Supreme Headquarters said the exact opposite. To accept Koch's analysis was to contradict the wisdom of every higher authority. But Patton had worked with Koch for years. He had watched Koch's assessments prove accurate time and again, from North Africa through Sicily through France. He trusted his intelligence officer's judgment more than he trusted the reassuring reports from headquarters. After a long silence, Patton stood and addressed his assembled staff. "We will be in a position to meet whatever happens." This was not a vague expression of confidence or a platitude to boost morale. It was a direct order. Patton directed his staff to begin developing contingency plans for reorienting Third Army to meet a German attack from the north. He wanted options. He wanted details. He wanted to be ready for something that every higher headquarters insisted would never happen. 3 days later, on December 12, Patton made the order explicit and specific. He instructed Brigadier General Hobart Gay, his Chief of Staff, and Colonel Halley Maddox, his operations officer, to draw up detailed contingency plans for a scenario that everyone else considered impossible. Patton told them exactly what he wanted. He wanted plans for pulling Third Army out of its current eastward attack, changing direction 90 degrees, moving north to Luxembourg, and attacking into the flank of any German offensive. This was an extraordinary demand. Third Army was heavily engaged in its own offensive operations, attacking toward the German frontier. Patton was asking his staff to plan for abandoning that attack, reversing direction, and launching an entirely different operation on a completely different axis, all while maintaining combat readiness. The logistical challenges alone were immense. The operational challenges were unprecedented. The staff set to work. They developed 3 plans, each designated by a simple code name. Patton chose coin denominations because they were easy to remember and could be communicated quickly over telephone or radio without confusion. He did not want elaborate code phrases that might be garbled in transmission. He wanted single words that his staff would recognize instantly. The first plan, codenamed Scent, directed an attack due north through Luxembourg and Diekirch towards St. Vith. This was the most aggressive option and Patton's personal preference. An attack on this axis would cut the German Bulge at its base and trap the maximum number of enemy forces east of the penetration. The second plan, codenamed Nickel, directed an attack from the vicinity of Arlon straight north to Bastogne. This plan prioritized the immediate relief of any forces that might be trapped at that critical road junction. The third plan, codenamed Dime, directed an attack against the western nose of any German penetration, wherever that might develop. If the Germans drove deep into Allied territory, Dime would hit them from the side as they advanced. Each plan specified in detail which divisions would move, which routes they would take, what supplies they would need, which support units would accompany them, and how quickly they could be ready to attack. The staff worked out the fuel calculations, the ammunition requirements, the traffic control measures, the communication networks, everything necessary to turn a concept into an executable operation. The details were prepared in advance so that execution would require only a single order, not days of additional planning. On December 15, Patton refined his guidance even further. He told his staff that he wanted them ready to implement any of the 3 plans on 6 hours' notice, not 6 days, not 60 hours, 6 hours. The divisions would know their routes, the supply depots would know their responsibilities, the signal units would know their frequencies. The only thing missing would be the word to go. The next morning, December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German offensive began. Over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, attacked along a 60-mile front in the Ardennes. Artillery batteries that had been moved into position under cover of darkness opened fire simultaneously. Infantry assault teams emerged from the forests. Panzer columns rolled forward through the morning fog. The assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units were overrun before they could organize resistance. Communication lines were cut within the first hour. Commanders lost contact with their subordinate units. Higher headquarters received fragmentary and often contradictory reports. The carefully maintained Allied line shattered like glass. struck by a hammer. When word of the attack reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, Eisenhower was attending the wedding of his orderly, Sergeant Mickey McKeer. Bradley was also in Versailles, meeting with Eisenhower to discuss the chronic shortage of infantry replacements. The initial reports from the Ardennes were fragmentary and confusing. No one was certain what was happening. Bradley's first reaction was to dismiss it as a local spoiling attack. The Germans were simply trying to disrupt Allied offensive operations, he believed. It was an annoyance, not a crisis. Nothing more than a desperate enemy striking out blindly. Eisenhower disagreed immediately. That is no spoiling attack, he told Bradley firmly. The Germans would not attack in an area with no strategic objectives unless they intended something major. The Ardennes offered no valuable targets for a limited operation. If the Germans had committed major forces there, they must be aiming for something big. Eisenhower recognized the danger before his subordinates did, but even Eisenhower had no immediate plan for responding. The attack had come in a sector that everyone had agreed was safe. The contingency planning for a German offensive in the Ardennes was essentially non-existent because no one had believed it possible. Patton's reaction was entirely different. When he received word of the German attack, he felt vindication rather than surprise. He had been expecting something like this. 3 weeks earlier, on November 25, he had written in his diary that First Army was making a terrible mistake by leaving 8th Corps static in the Ardennes. He believed the Germans were building up opposite them. His intelligence officer had warned him repeatedly. Now the warning had proven accurate. On the evening of December 17th, Patton met with his senior staff at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy. The situation in the Ardennes was deteriorating rapidly. German forces had penetrated deep into the American line. Several units were cut off and fighting for survival. The scope of the offensive was becoming clear. Patton told his staff to be prepared to execute any of the 3 contingency plans at a moment's notice. Then he did something that demonstrated the difference between planning and actually being ready. He ordered the 4th Armored Division to begin repositioning that very night, before any order came from higher headquarters, before any decision was made at Supreme Command, before the Verdun conference was even scheduled. The 4th Armored Division moved out on the night of December 18, heading north toward the developing crisis. Patton was not waiting for permission. He was positioning his forces so that, when permission came, he would already be ahead of events. The summons to Verdun came on December 18th. Eisenhower was convening an emergency conference of senior commanders for the following morning. This would be the meeting where decisions were made. Patton spent the evening with his staff, reviewing the 3 plans one final time, ensuring every detail was in place. On the morning of December 19, before departing for the conference, Patton briefed his key commanders on what he expected would happen. He gave specific instructions and established the code word system that would allow instant execution. If Eisenhower ordered an attack toward Bastogne, Patton would telephone his chief of staff and say simply, "Nickel." Everything would already be in motion. The conference at Verdun convened at 11 in the morning in a cold, smoky second-floor room of the Caserne de Jardin-Fontaine, an old French army barracks. A small pot-bellied stove in the corner provided inadequate heat against the December chill. Most of the officers kept their heavy overcoats on throughout the meeting. Their breath was visible in the frigid air. Eisenhower arrived accompanied by Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, his British deputy. Also present were Bradley, Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, commanding the 6th Army Group, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, serving as Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Harold Bull as SHAEF Operations Officer, and Major General Kenneth Strong as SHAEF F intelligence chief. Other senior staff officers filled out the room. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group and all Allied forces in the northern sector, was conspicuously absent. Montgomery had refused to attend any meeting not held at his own headquarters. His absence would have significant consequences in the days ahead, when the crisis forced Eisenhower to temporarily place American armies under Montgomery's command, creating friction that lasted for the remainder of the war. Eisenhower opened the conference by deliberately setting an optimistic tone. He knew his commanders were shaken by the magnitude of the German surprise. He needed to restore their confidence. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster, he declared, looking around the table. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Patton responded with characteristic aggression. Hell, let us have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris, he said. Then we will really cut them off and chew them up. Eisenhower appreciated the spirit but rejected the strategy. George, that is fine, but the enemy must never be allowed to cross the Meuse. The Meuse River ran roughly north to south through Belgium. If the Germans crossed it, they would have a clear path to the critical port of Antwerp. Losing Antwerp would cripple Allied logistics for months. The Meuse was the line that could not be crossed. Major General Kenneth Strong then briefed the group on the German penetration. The situation map showed a bulge, soon to become the battle's name, pushing deep into the Allied line. Several American divisions were surrounded or cut off. Communications with units in the penetration area were sporadic. The town of Bastogne, where 7 major roads converged, was nearly encircled by German forces. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would have the road network they needed to sustain their advance. Eisenhower absorbed the briefing and then turned to Patton. George, I want you to command this move. Under Brad's supervision, of course, making a strong counterattack with at least 6 divisions. When can you start? Patton answered immediately. As soon as you are through with me. Eisenhower pressed him. When can you attack? The morning of December 21, with 3 divisions, Patton replied. The reaction in the room was visible and immediate. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Koch, Patton's personal aide, who was present as a witness, later recorded what he saw. There was a stir, a shuffling of feet, as those present straightened up in their chairs. In some faces, skepticism. In others, the expression of men who believed they were witnessing a general make a fool of himself. Major General Kenneth Strong noted that there was some laughter, especially from British officers present. One staff officer recalled that Patton's claim almost knocked him out of his chair. The skepticism was understandable. Patton was proposing to disengage 3 divisions from active combat where they were currently engaged, move them over 100 miles on icy roads clogged with retreating traffic, turn them 90 degrees to face a completely different direction, and launch a coordinated attack against a powerful enemy, all in 48 hours. Conventional military wisdom held that such an operation would require weeks of planning and preparation, not 2 days. Eisenhower's response was blunt. Do not be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you will not have all 3 divisions ready and you will go piecemeal. You will lose them one at a time. Patton pushed back. I would not have made the statement if I did not have the plans already prepared. This caught Eisenhower's attention. Plans already prepared? No other commander had arrived with plans. Bradley had no plan. Devers had no plan. The staff at Supreme Headquarters had no plan. Only Patton had come to this meeting, ready to act immediately. Eisenhower relented partially but remained cautious. He ordered Patton to wait until December 22 to ensure all 3 divisions were fully prepared and could attack together rather than piecemeal. 1 day later than Patton proposed. Still impossibly fast by any conventional measure. Patton accepted the 1-day delay. But when the meeting ended and Eisenhower had selected the Bastogne relief option, confirming that the counterattack would go north to relieve the surrounded garrison rather than cut the base of the penetration, Patton walked out, found a telephone, called his headquarters in Nancy, and spoke 2 words: "Play ball." That code phrase set everything in motion. The 3 divisions designated for the immediate counterattack were the 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey, the 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul, and the 80th Infantry Division under Major General Horace McBride. Together they formed the 3rd Corps under the command of Major General John Milliken. The 4th Armored Division had already begun moving on December 18, before the Verdun Conference even took place, because Patton had ordered them north as a precaution. Now the movement accelerated to full speed. The division covered 150 miles in 19 hours, racing northwest from Lorraine into Belgium over roads packed with snow, ice, and the debris of retreating American units moving in the opposite direction. The 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division, undertook a separate movement on December 20th that covered over 175 miles in 15 hours. They drove through the night, through freezing temperatures, through chaos and confusion, arriving at their assembly area in Belgium just before midnight. The tank crews were exhausted, but ready to fight. The logistical challenges were immense, perhaps unprecedented in modern warfare. The weather was brutal, one of the worst winters in 50 years across Western Europe. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Roads were sheets of ice. Snow accumulated faster than it could be cleared. Visibility dropped to near zero in frequent blizzards. Vehicles slid into ditches. Trucks jackknifed on curves. Convoys encountered landslides, weakened bridges that threatened to collapse under the weight of tanks, enemy bombing and strafing attacks, and wrecks from earlier accidents that blocked the roads and forced long detours. Traffic control became a nightmare as advancing columns met retreating units traveling the opposite direction on the same narrow roads. Third Army's support echelons performed miracles of logistics. They moved 62,000 tons of supplies to support the reorientation, rerouting material that had been positioned for an entirely different offensive in an entirely different direction. Ammunition trains delivered an average of 4,500 tons of ammunition per day during the last half of December, more than twice the normal consumption rate, building stockpiles for an attack of unprecedented intensity. Signal units strung 20,000 miles of field wire to establish communications along the new axis, creating from scratch the entire communication network needed to coordinate a 3-division attack. The old wire networks were useless because they ran east and west. The new attack would run north. Everything had to be rebuilt. The transportation section moved 11,800 vehicles over 4 troop movement routes in the initial 72 hours. They accomplished this despite enemy attacks, despite the weather, despite the roads, despite the fact that traffic control plans had to be improvised on the spot because no one had expected to need them. The supply depot at Longwy, France, was completely reconfigured in less than 14 hours to support operations in a direction opposite to what had been planned just days before. Ordnance units redistributed spare parts and weapons. Medical units repositioned aid stations and evacuation routes. Quartermaster units rerouted food, fuel, and winter equipment. The entire logistical apparatus of Third Army pivoted as a single coordinated organism. On December 22 at 6 in the morning, exactly as Patton had promised at Verdun, exactly on the day Eisenhower had specified, 3rd Corps attacked northward toward Bastogne. The fighting was brutal from the first moment. German forces had been specifically assigned to protect the southern flank of the offensive, precisely because German planners had anticipated a counterattack by Patton. They knew he was the most aggressive American commander. They knew he would come. The 7th German Army under General Erich Brandenberger held the blocking mission. His orders from Hitler were explicit: protect the southern flank at all costs. Delay the American counterattack long enough for the main German forces to reach the Meuse River. Brandenberger had only 4 infantry divisions with minimal armour support, perhaps 30 assault guns in total, but he positioned them skillfully along the routes to Bastogne. Every village became a strong point. Every crossroads was defended. Every forest line concealed ambush positions. The 4th Armoured Division spearheaded the American attack, but met fierce resistance that slowed their advance to a crawl. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew their offensive depended on buying time. They contested every foot of ground. They counterattacked when they could. They died in their positions when they could not. The weather prevented air support for the first several days of the attack, grounding the aircraft that might have broken open the German defences. Low clouds and falling snow kept Allied fighters and bombers on the ground, while American tankers and infantrymen fought alone against prepared positions. Inside Bastogne, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units had been surrounded since December 21st. German forces encircled the town completely, cutting off all supply routes. The defenders had limited ammunition, limited food, and limited medical supplies. Wounded men were dying for lack of treatment. The garrison was holding, but it could not hold forever. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce and delivered a demand for surrender. The message warned that the American forces were surrounded and their situation was hopeless. Continued resistance would only result in unnecessary death. The demand reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defence of Bastogne. McAuliffe had been sleeping when the German envoys arrived, exhausted from days of constant crisis. When his staff woke him and showed him the surrender demand, McAuliffe's initial reaction was irritation. He muttered a single word that expressed his feelings about the German proposal. When his staff asked for an official written response to send back to the Germans, McAuliffe was uncertain what to say. One of his officers suggested he simply write what he had said when he first read the demand. McAuliffe agreed. The official American response to the German surrender demand consisted of one word: nuts. The German officers who received this response were confused. They asked the American officers who delivered it what the word meant. The American colonel explained, "It means the same as go to hell. And I will tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every German that tries to break into this city." The defiant response boosted morale inside Bastogne, but defiance alone would not save the garrison. They were still surrounded. They were still running low on everything they needed to fight. If relief did not come soon, they would be overwhelmed. Patton drove his commanders relentlessly, appearing at forward positions, demanding progress, accepting no excuses. On December 22, he noted in his diary the firepower Third Army was bringing to bear. "We now have 108 battalions of corps and army artillery supporting this attack," he wrote. In other words, 1,296 guns of 105 millimeters or bigger. "I do not see how the Boche can take this much artillery." On December 23, the weather finally cleared. The clouds lifted. The sun appeared. And Allied aircraft swarmed over the battlefield in overwhelming numbers. Cargo planes dropped desperately needed supplies to the Bastogne garrison, including ammunition, food and medical equipment, by parachute. Fighter bombers struck German positions, columns and supply lines with devastating effect. The air power that had been grounded for days now made up for lost time. Patton wrote in his diary that evening, "What a glorious day for killing Germans." Christmas Day. 1944 was clear and cold. American and German soldiers faced each other across the frozen landscape of Belgium, fighting on the day that celebrated peace on Earth. Patton recorded his thoughts. A clear cold Christmas, lovely weather for killing Germans, which seems a bit queer, seeing whose birthday it is. The same diary entry contained a more sobering reflection on the overall situation. We can still lose this war. Patton was not merely being dramatic. The outcome remained uncertain. German forces still held the initiative in several sectors. The Bastogne garrison still needed relief. The crisis was not yet over. The relief force was close, but not close enough. German defenders fought with desperate determination, knowing that if Bastogne was relieved, their entire offensive would be compromised. The road to Bastogne passed through villages with names like Assenois, Clochemont, and Cibray, each one defended, each one costing American lives, to capture. On December 26, Patton wrote in his diary that the day had been rather trying. Despite all our efforts, he wrote, we have failed to make contact with the defenders of Bastogne. He wrote this entry in the early afternoon, not knowing that contact was only hours away. The 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, reached the village of Assenois in the late afternoon of December 26. The village blocked the final approach to Bastogne. German defenders held positions in the houses and along the tree lines. There was no time for a careful, deliberate attack. The garrison could not wait any longer. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the battalion, ordered his tanks to attack straight through the village at full speed, guns blazing, crushing any resistance. The assault was violent and brief. American tanks roared through Assenois, machine guns firing, cannon blasting, infantry riding on the hulls, shooting at anything that moved. German resistance collapsed in the face of this furious charge. Beyond Assenois, the road led directly to Bastogne. At 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944, First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King, led his column into the southern outskirts of Bastogne. His tank was an M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo, an assault variant with extra armor plate on the hull and turret. Boggess spotted figures in American uniforms ahead and called out to identify them. The response came from First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Webster had been waiting, hoping, praying for this moment. The siege was broken. Bastogne was relieved. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams arrived and shook hands with General McAuliffe. The corridor into Bastogne was narrow, barely 300 yards wide at its narrowest point, and it would take 2 more weeks of bitter fighting to widen and secure it. But the immediate crisis was over. The garrison had held, the relief had arrived, the German offensive had lost its momentum. Hitler's gamble had failed. The significance of what Patton and Third Army accomplished in those 10 days cannot be measured solely by the relief of Bastogne, though that achievement saved thousands of American lives. The real significance lies in what the operation revealed about the difference between adequate generalship and exceptional generalship. Every general at the Verdun conference was competent. They understood tactics, strategy, and logistics. But when the crisis struck, they arrived with only general ideas. They needed time to develop plans. Patton arrived with 3 plans ready and his divisions already moving. The difference was that Patton had thought seriously about what might go wrong before it went wrong. This was method, not luck. Patton believed a commander's job was to anticipate events, not simply react to them. He wrote in his memoirs that moving 3 divisions in winter from one battlefield to another over crowded roads with a 90-degree change in direction of attack is one of the most difficult operations of war. He knew this because he had prepared for it before the need arose. The relationship between Patton and Oscar Koch illustrated another crucial principle. A commander is only as good as his intelligence, and intelligence is only as good as the commander's willingness to hear unwelcome assessments. Koch told Patton things that contradicted the official consensus. Patton listened and acted on his analysis. Other commanders dismissed similar warnings because they did not fit the prevailing narrative. Koch later wrote that the intelligence failure preceding the Battle of the Bulge was not in collection but in evaluation of the intelligence at hand. The same raw data was available to every headquarters. Third Army took it seriously. Others explained it away. German commanders had anticipated that Patton would counterattack from the south. They expected it. They planned for it. They assigned an entire army, the 7th Army under Brandenburger, to blocking the southern flank, specifically because they knew Patton would come. What they did not expect was the speed. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in the main attack, had worried about strong American forces appearing in the Bastogne area by the evening of the third day of the offensive. This prediction proved only slightly optimistic. Third Army attacked on December 22, roughly 4 days after the offensive began, and reached Bastogne on December 26. But the Germans had expected the American response to take weeks, not days. They had counted on having more time. After the war, captured German officers were asked which American commander had impressed them most. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had served as the nominal commander of German forces in the West during the Ardennes offensive, reportedly gave a simple answer. Patton was your best. General Günther Blumentritt, who had served as von Rundstedt's chief of staff, offered a more detailed assessment. He called Patton the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, reportedly called Patton the American Guderian, comparing him to Germany's greatest tank commander. These post-war assessments should be viewed with some caution. Military historian Harry Eade has noted that former Wehrmacht officers tended to upgrade their opinions of Patton after the war, partly to curry favor with American occupation authorities and later NATO allies, partly because praising a capable enemy reflected well on their own performance. During the war itself, Patton was one of many threats the Germans faced, a competent and aggressive armor commander, but not necessarily the uniquely feared figure of post-war legend. What remains indisputable is the operational achievement. In 72 hours, Third Army disengaged 3 divisions from active combat, moved them over 100 miles on icy roads through brutal winter weather, reoriented them 90 degrees, and launched a coordinated attack that relieved a besieged garrison and halted the most dangerous German offensive of the Western War. Colonel Charles Codman, who witnessed the Verdun conference and the desperate days that followed, provided the most comprehensive assessment. To disengage 3 divisions actually in combat, he wrote, and launch them over more than 100 miles of icy roads straight into the heart of a major attack of unprecedented violence presented problems which few commanders would have undertaken to resolve in that length of time. The achievement was the product of a system that Patton had built over years. His staff officers knew his methods so well that they could anticipate his intent. His division commanders understood his expectations and needed only minimal guidance. His logistical apparatus had practiced rapid reorientation so many times it could perform complex movements almost automatically. Patton created that system by demanding contingency planning when others considered it unnecessary, cultivating intelligence officers who told uncomfortable truths, and training his staff to think ahead rather than simply react. Martin Blumenson, the historian who edited Patton's papers and wrote extensively about his career, called the Bastogne operation probably the finest hour in Patton's distinguished career. He noted that nowhere during the war was the American mastery of logistics more dramatically displayed, but he also emphasized that Patton's sound staff work was generally underrated by those who saw only his flamboyant public persona. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945 with a comprehensive German defeat. The offensive that Hitler had hoped would split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace instead consumed irreplaceable German reserves. The Wehrmacht lost over 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured in the Ardennes. It lost 800 tanks and assault guns, over 1,000 aircraft, and enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and equipment that German industry could no longer replace. The war would continue for 4 more months, but the Ardennes offensive marked the last significant German operation in the West. The Wehrmacht never recovered from the losses it suffered in that frozen forest. The road to final defeat led through the ruins of Hitler's last gamble. Patton continued to drive his Third Army eastward into Germany through the spring of 1945. In March, Third Army crossed the Rhine before any other Allied force. Fulfilling a promise Patton had made to himself, he could not resist a theatrical gesture for the occasion. He stopped on a pontoon bridge over the river, unzipped his trousers, and urinated into the Rhine, while a staff photographer captured the moment for posterity. In December 1945, almost exactly 1 year after the Battle of the Bulge, Patton was severely injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car collided with an army truck, and Patton was thrown against the partition separating the front and rear seats. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. George Patton died on December 21, 1945 at the age of 60, 12 days after the accident. He was buried in the American military cemetery at Luxembourg among the soldiers of Third Army who had died liberating Europe. He had requested to be buried with his men rather than return to the United States. His grave remains there today, still visited by thousands every year. The lessons of what he accomplished in December 1944 remain relevant far beyond the military context. Patton succeeded where others were surprised, not because he was smarter or braver or more aggressive. Though he may have been all of those things, he succeeded because he prepared for contingencies that others dismissed as impossible. He listened to intelligence that contradicted the comfortable consensus. He trained his organization to respond instantly to the unexpected. Most people plan for what they expect to happen. They prepare for scenarios that seem likely and comfortable. They dismiss warnings that contradict their assumptions. They are surprised when reality fails to match their expectations. Patton planned for what he feared might happen. He prepared for scenarios that seemed unlikely but dangerous. He listened to warnings that others dismissed. He was ready when the unexpected occurred. That difference in mental approach, that willingness to take seriously the possibilities that others refused to consider, determined the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. The town of Bastogne still stands in the Belgian Ardennes. A large memorial in the shape of a star marks the site where American soldiers held out against overwhelming odds during that desperate winter. The memorial is called the Marderson, and it bears the names of all 50 American states and the inscription that the Belgian people honor the memory of the American soldiers who fought here. The Sherman tank Cobra King, the first American vehicle to break through the German encirclement and relieve the Bastogne garrison, survived the war and is now displayed at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The tank bears the scars of its service, the dents and scrapes accumulated over months of combat across France, Belgium, and Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion during the relief operation and shook hands with General McAuliffe on the day the siege was broken, continued to serve with distinction. He rose to become a 4-star general and served as Army Chief of Staff during the Vietnam War era. When the Army developed its next-generation main battle tank to replace the aging M60 series, they named it the M1 Abrams in his honor. The Abrams tank remains the primary battle tank of the United States Army today. Oscar Koch, the intelligence officer whose warnings made the rapid response possible by giving Patton the information and time he needed to prepare, retired from the Army as a brigadier general. He spent his later years writing and teaching about intelligence methodology, trying to ensure that the lessons of the Bulge would not be forgotten by future generations of intelligence officers. His book on serving as Patton's intelligence chief remains a standard text in military education programs to this day. The soldiers who executed the impossible march from Lorraine to Bastogne are mostly gone now. The tank crews who drove through the freezing night, the infantrymen who rode on the hulls of tanks because there were not enough trucks, the truck drivers who navigated icy roads through blinding snow, the mechanics who kept vehicles running despite the brutal cold, the signalmen who strung 20,000 miles of wire to establish communications, the supply clerks who reconfigured entire depots in hours, the cooks who fed the armies, the medics who treated the wounded, the men who did the 1,000 unglamorous jobs that make military operations possible. Their names are mostly forgotten now, lost to time and the passing of generations, but their achievement endures in the historical record and in the lessons their performance continues to teach. They proved that preparation matters more than genius, that listening to uncomfortable truths matters more than believing comfortable lies, that the difference between success and failure is often decided not in the moment of crisis, but in the weeks and months before, when someone has the foresight and the discipline to ask the question that no one else wants to consider. What if we are wrong? George Patton asked that question when others did not. He demanded that his staff provide answers. He prepared for possibilities that his superiors dismissed as impossible. And when the Germans attacked through the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, when every other Allied headquarters was scrambling to understand what was happening and figure out how to respond, George Patton already knew exactly what to do. He had 3 plans ready. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from today. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to history enthusiasts who believe these stories must never be allowed to fade away. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive for future generations